Hello everyone, we are here in the sanctuary of First Congregational Church in our second conversation with the composer. This composer is Patrick Cassidy. We're so glad you're here, Patrick.
Thank you.
And today we're here with also Reverend Laura Vale-Fragan and Reverend Michael Lehman, our spiritual leaders at First Congregational, and we're going to get to chewing on the Mass from a very different angle from last week. Last week, you remember, if you haven't seen it, you can go see it on YouTube, that we spoke with the singers who created the work, this album that we're releasing next week. And this week we're going to talk some about the theology and about the experience of the Mass in our services. So thank you both for being here to share your time and for being such positive energy in this project from the beginning.
Thank you, Dave.
So today we release the Annus Dei, which is our third single, right? 1, 2, 3, our fourth single that we will release. You can hear all four of them on YouTube or on multiple platforms right now. And the Annus Dei is the culminating movement of the Mass. It is a movement that many people say is their favorite for a variety of reasons. We heard that yesterday, yes, regardless of who's setting the Mass. And I'm just curious where we kind of left off our last conversation with the Annus Dei and with Patrick saying it was your favorite of the text, and I thought we could start today with, since we just did it yesterday live for the first time in a service, that we could start off talking about the Annus Dei. And Patrick, picking up on that thread of, you had mentioned it being a text that came from Syria, and you were talking about how the Mass came together. Just pick up that ball and run with it.
Well, the Mass itself is not a sacred text. It grew organically within the early church, and the Agnus Dei first appeared in the Syrian church, and then it was adopted by the church in general at a later date. And amazingly, actually, there actually was a pope, a Syrian pope in the early church, and he had been the last non-European pope prior to St. Francis, who was the current pope. And so, for myself personally, I love the words and the sentiment of the Agnus Dei. And even the wish for peace at the end, it's just a perfect prayer and beautiful. So I gave it special attention, and it was one of the earlier pieces that I wrote, in actual fact.
I also connected with the Dona Nobis Pacem, the Grant Us Peace, at the end of that movement yesterday in worship. In that space, in that moment, it became this profound prayer for me as well. And I'm curious, Patrick, as you were composing that, how did you connect, perhaps from your past or even recent experiences in composing that powerful, gripping prayer at the end of that movement?
When I wrote the piece, David says that it's the most Irish of all the movements, and I didn't have to try too hard, because that's who I am, I suppose. But I came up with this motif, in a musical sense, I came up with this motif, and it continues throughout the piece, and it accumulates with all the bits coming together at the end for the Dona Nobis Pacem. And for me, peace is central to Christianity. And there's also, in the Gloria, there is an exaltation of peace as well, and peace to men of good will. So for me in the Mass, they were very special moments in the composition that I just had to give special attention to, especially in the times we live in. Yes. I thought it was important.
Yes.
When you do a really interesting compositional thing, you mentioned that motive that I've said is the most Irish. Of all of the movements, modality shows up in a major way in this piece. And I think one of the reasons is you give us this 6-note downward melody that just keeps resetting at different pitches, and it changes throughout. And because it's 6 notes, because therefore you get 2 half steps, this kind of thing, it's got this modal energy that we won't spend time explaining what that means, but if you want to know, send me an email. But you hear it as transient and fluid, which is why we used it in yesterday's service that was focused on sacred flow. Because it just keeps moving around, but you feel like you're with it the whole time. And you give us about 4 minutes of that pretty unadulterated. It's just there and it happens over and over. There's a little break, and then the melody flips and goes upward in a 5-note return. And so it's like this very human statement. In fact, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but 6 in numerology is often related to the human, earthbound humanity. Downward moving, search for peace. And then when we get to peace, it's actually going upward and coming back to us. And I don't know how intentional that was, but as a conductor, I was reading into that. And at the very least, that simple switch from downward to upward it's so simple, and yet it is transporting. How much of that speaks to you, or were you thinking about it, or is it just like, oh, cool, that musician figured that out? I don't know.
When I was composing the Mass, I certainly was very aware of the Celtic Church, and I really wish that my Mass would belong to that tradition of the Celtic Church. And in Celtic design, which we know from the Book of Kells, the Ard Chalice, that there is this design that is interconnected, and there's a sense of infinity and eternity at the same time, and no beginning, no end. And so I think the piece maybe has a feeling of that in the way it just keeps moving. And the rest is just counterpoint, I think.
Right, it's just working it out. That is a statement for the times. The rest is just counterpoint.
So I'm wondering, hearing it in this space, in the middle of this series that we're doing on sacred earth, sacred souls, how do you feel about experiencing the piece since we're diving and swimming in Celtic theology?
Well, I have to say, when I heard the piece performed, and even on the album, the full album of the Mass, David's interpretation and the performance, and also Christoph, they gave the piece a sacredness that I did not even know was there at the time. For me, it was counterpoint, and yes, I did have feelings about, structure and certain aspects of the Mass I wanted to be individual to me, but the sacredness, I didn't see it because it doesn't exist in paper. It exists in the people who sing it, interpret it, perform it. And I found that to be quite astonishing, the experience, yeah.
When that goes back to what Laura, you and Patrick were talking about just before we got started, which was how important and meaningful the conversations we've had after the services have been with Patrick. And I've loved watching all the different congregants come up and get into conversation with you. But will you say more about kind of your experience with...
I think I said before we started that I wished we could have recorded some of those. There's been several of those after worship that I even looked at Patrick and said, yes, we should have recorded this because it would have been so perfect. But it's so meaningful to people, and I think, all of it's tying together. The liturgy, the message, the music, and it's just creating this beautiful flow that people are really being able to experience, I think, in a new way. And I think, the theology behind this is a little heretical, but,
Yes.
We're throwing some concepts out there that are definitely new to some people. But we've talked about this, as Michael said this morning in our meeting, this idea of remembering what we already know. And I think the words that we're putting in liturgy and all of those things are reminding us of that. But the music then gives us a space to experience that. Does that feel, when you're sitting here, I'm curious how it feels, but I'm also curious about what it feels like out on Mayflower Courtyard when people are talking to you about it.
Yes, I think, a lot of the great people in the church have been people who have been, tried to create change and have been accused of being heretical. Even the present Pope is disliked intensely by conservatives. And so you're in good company for
It's good to know.
And for me, I think what I'm experiencing now with it at First Church is the core of the piece that I wrote has been revealed. An awful lot of it was subconscious. And Irish music is very, very much based on the Greek chants that are used in plain chant. And, you know, there was no composition of the Mass during the golden period of the Irish Church, which is the period when we have all this beautiful visual art, because at that time people sang traditional plain chant. And nobody really, and that just is something that evolved gradually, like, I suppose, the text of the Mass itself. So we don't have a music to reflect that period, except for the Latin plain chant. And I wish that my Mass could have something of that spirit within it. And it seems like a remarkable coincidence that the Mass should end up in First Church, where you are embracing this Celtic theology, you know, that isn't even being embraced by the Catholic Church in Ireland. It's remarkable. And it seems like God is working in mysterious ways to bring us together to do this.
Yeah, Laura, Michael, will y'all talk a little about this series and where it came from and why we're doing it now, and, you know, that it fell in our laps? You were thinking about this way in the spring before we actually started using this, so.
Yeah, and I didn't even truly think about the connection until you said, well, this makes a lot of sense. You know, we always do, or we've started doing a creation series in the fall. We follow the liturgical calendar, and so we were looking for what was going to be our theme, and Newell's book wasn't even printed. We were trying to get an early copy so that we could make plans. But when we started putting it together, and then David saw how it fits so well with the Mass, it is the flow. It is just stepping into that. And I think it's been beautifully woven.
It has. I love the connection too. One of those figures, one of the three patron saints, Saint Bridget, one of the three patron saints of Ireland, you know, talks about, or represents, I guess, that the possibility between two worlds, or between what we once held or still hold as opposites, and there kind of bridges those. I'm curious, Patrick, your experience too, coming to First Church, how other connections you've seen, you know, between those worlds, or perhaps worlds we've not even mentioned yet, coming together. Yeah.
It's certainly First Church. In practical terms, the belief here and I think the ethos is very much reflects what I feel internally myself. I remember, I mean, for me, the most touching moment here at First Church was the virtual service on Easter Thursday, when you spoke the last testament of people who had been executed. I was deeply moved by that sense of goodwill and kindness. It was very, very beautiful. That was, for me, that was a highlight of my relationship with this church.
Well, and riffing off of Bridget again, this iconic figure in the history of humanity that doesn't get talked about very much, and this idea of justice. And in your sermon, you held space for the light that the church that she built kept alive until the English came in and forced it underground in a very unjust way. Yes. So in that moment, you wove in the justice narrative and helped us touch that through her life. I love that about the two of you and how you bring so many thoughts into each moment so that we can live through kind of a fullness in every sermon and in every service. So thank you for bringing that up, Patrick. Yeah. With the Bridget service, that's when we sang the Et Incarnatus Est. I have to say, one of my favorite things about doing worship here is watching the two of you respond to the meditation anthem as you get up to preach. And Michael, as a professional musician, I watch you, I can see it's like you're analyzing the piece and just emotionally open to it.
Yes.
That particular one is, for all of you who are less familiar with it, is the one where the text is Jesus was born, Pontius Pilate killed him, and he died. And Patrick, I've said this multiple times, you set that piece such that the birth and the death music are the exact same, which is this notion of Celtic theology of, like you were saying, the cyclical nature of life. But in Western Christianity, that's a straight line from birth to heaven. And so that setting is in itself a kind of heresy in Western religion, but it also belies this Celtic faith. I just gave you a lot to respond to, Michael, but in that moment when we finished and I looked at you, it was like you were channeling something. And you actually, before you preached, you thanked everyone, which I thought was really cool. Do you remember what was going on emotionally or intellectually or whatever that connected that piece to your sermon?
Yeah, thanks. I think I recall just a sense of timelessness in space. Not knowing the text, I will confess I was not looking at that point because I was thinking about my sermon, allowed myself to sink into this music, which I think this Mass has done repeatedly, even in virtual space. I remember texting you after many a service, David, saying, that was profound. Even here at home, there was a holy space that was made and created. In that moment, yes, of course, I think as a musician, but for me, what the gift that music does as I go into the pulpit or the lectern is to fill and to inspire and to propel what it is I'm about to say. So what a gift it has been. Have you had that experience, Laura?
Yeah, I was actually thinking back to the virtual services too, because I realized in the last couple weeks, going back and looking at some of those services, that it was when pieces of the Mass would come on that I would cry. And, trying to keep a church like this together during that whole time, truthfully, I didn't allow myself a lot of crying. No crying here, we got to get this stuff done. But I would sit in my living room, with my husband, the fireplace going, whatever, my dog, and when those Mass pieces came on, I would just sob. And it was a gift of feeling what you were talking about, that timelessness. It was also, for me, a gift of feeling held, as if those pieces were holding me. I say a lot, that there are things that make me remember where I came from and where I will go. And I think that was in the midst of so much death, so much sadness, so much just an unbelievable world that we were living in. I felt held, and I remembered that no matter what happens, these two things will always be there. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, et incarnutus est. I actually checked yesterday, and yes, most composers have split that text into two movements. And I actually wasn't aware of it, and you're absolutely right. But I think it was subconscious. But for me, in the Creed, the first part of the Creed deals with God, and then it deals with the Son of God, and then with the Holy Spirit. And for me, it seemed obvious that it should be this section of the Creed about Jesus should be one movement. It seemed just the obvious thing to do. And I suppose it was subconscious, but it was the right thing to do. And I'm so happy that people have connected with it in this way. And I think the cyclical nature of life and death, in Celtic art even, there's a special symbolism with the number 3. Life, death, rebirth, past, present, future. And I think that subconscious aspect of my being approached the piece from that aspect. Yes.
Well, and that lays into, you have said, and I know no other information to discredit this, that this is the first setting of the Latin Mass by an Irish composer. And so a lot of these elements, as you're saying, well, that's just kind of who I am. Nobody else was had your background or even close to it, you know, and so you look at all the Germanic and Italian and French settings and mainland Europe at the time they were writing whatever, and they did split that up. They made big deals out of the birth as one thing and then big deals out of the death as another. And, you know, like Haydn's little organ mass, and resurrexit, resurrexit. So there's just the way that where they were, time and place, etc. So this is very special. It is not to put too fine a point on it, but you being you, where you are in life, where you are in time, writing this piece, you have brought to it such a different perspective that I think people today need, as we've heard from you two, in the emotional response, and want. And I'm so excited that we're getting to explore that a little. Like to look at another example, the Sanctus, which was the first piece we recorded. We talked about it a little bit last time with Elizabeth solo, and it was the first single we released. And that text, holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, heaven and earth are full of your glory. You look at the vast number of settings, but just to take a few, you know, Bach's from the B minor Mass, it's as if Bach took on the task of musically capturing that sense of glory, and I think he succeeded. I don't know anybody else who could have, but when you sing that Sanctus in its massive compound duple time, and it just flows and grows, and then you have that crazy fugue at the end, it's like he's saying, the gates of heaven are open, and we're hearing it right here. Benjamin Britten, after World War II, in the War Requiem, uses the Sanctus as almost to strip the church down and say, what have you done? And he uses very Eastern elements, and he's creating this universal pastiche as he's pointing at the church and saying, you had a big role to play in destroying the world. And what are you going to say about it? It's this calling out, this questioning, and it's profound. But your Sanctus does, those are big, big gestures for big, big words. But yours is almost more personal. It like Laura was saying, it gives us an intimate space. With this big language, you make it about each individual somehow. And any of you can respond to that, but I keep coming back to that movement as a place that's a kind of Rosetta Stone for this piece as a whole.
Yeah. I wonder if that's perhaps an unintentional Celtic move.
Well, Sanctus is recited 3 times, so again you have that Celtic use of that number. Even before Christianity, it was a very sacred number in Celtic art. You have the triskelion, which is the basic Celtic squiggly knotted symbol. And the oldest one is on Newgrange, which is a burial mound in Ireland that is dates to 3000 BC. But then you see it in Christian art, like the Book of Kells also, and the Ardagh Chalice. So I think the threeness was something that grabbed me immediately when I saw that piece. And my Mass generally is more solemn than the typical Mass of the classical period. I try to bring it back more to the plain chant tradition of the early church.
Yeah, and that text, alludes to Revelation 4, this glorious scene of heaven. And when I said you got an unintentional Celtic move, what you've done, at least musically, has been to bring that scene, at least this is how I experienced it in the many times I've watched that video since it was premiered. That scene has been brought to earth. Again, those worlds bridged, heaven and earth intertwined, and we get to experience it in a very human way, a very humble way, from this glorious scene down to the human heart.
Like, the Celts talk about thin places. Thin places. And I think that's happened with this. I think it's happened here. It happened when we were doing it, even, video recording all of it. But there are very few places in our life, in our everyday lives, that are thin places, where heaven and earth come together. Are there places at home in Ireland that are thin places to you?
I don't know, in Ireland you have this dichotomy between, say, Celtic Christianity, where people go to pray at holy wells, and they, beside the holy well you always have a tree where you have rags, and the rags are belong to sick people, and it's a very kind of very close to the earth nature. But then you also have a very dour form of Christianity as well. In Ireland we had this Jansenism movement, which was a very puritanical form of Catholicism. We were all terrified growing up. And in the Mass, I think I'm trying to bring back the peacefulness, the kindness. That's something I experience here. And but I do also think in Ireland there are places, that are very sacred. The Celtic monks they had this thing that was peculiar to Ireland of going into exile. And they set up these monasteries in places like Skellig Michael, which is 7 miles off the coast of the west coast of Ireland.
People will know it from the Star Wars movies.
Exactly, yes. And then Iona off the coast of Scotland. And these are places where monks went, I suppose, to feel closer to God, to exile themselves from the human experience. And so I suppose those are the thin places in Ireland, yes.
And I wonder, Laura, hearing y'all talk, we talk a lot about the idea of universality. Patrick, you even mentioned it, that the word Catholic means universal. And there's one version of universal, like the Ben Carson, well, of course we all think the same way as soon as you think like I think. But there's this other form of universal that is really, what you were preaching about yesterday, the connection of all things, the flow through time and space. And as I keep coming back to this work, that sense of universality connects directly through the individual, and therefore the individual has to be a part of it, and therefore the created space for the individual it becomes paramount. I'm curious, Laura, if you could say more about that sense of universality within the scope of this church and your experience.
So, growing up very conservative Christian, universalism was a no, just a flat out no. And so when I started believing and experiencing that, that all paths lead to God. There's no one way, there's no perfect way, but all paths lead to God. I just felt that it was so important for the churches where I served had that openness. So in this church, we have people who come who are Buddhist, who are Muslim, atheist, agnostics, and everything else too. But I think it is trying to create this space where we can all look for the spirituality, where we can all remember what we already know in the terms of Newell. And to hear people that are here now speak of that, people who will come in and say, I've never been to church before in my life. I don't know anything about God. Is it okay if I'm here? And it's like, oh, this is perfect. We're glad you're here. But I think your piece, even though it has the parts of the creed, it's very doctrinally sound, I think it is universal. And I think that is so different than other masses. I think the church wrote because, in many ways, put things together to get people to believe a certain way. And it was to ingrain those. And your piece is an opening, which I think really is the good news. We talk a lot these days about what is the good news. And I think that universality is the good news.
Yes.
And I think the piece is really helpful in being able to spread that.
I hope that the piece, now that it's it's really the first church mass in a sense. But I hope it helps this church with its mission, which is a very good mission, and a mission that's needed, I believe. Sorry.
Yes. No, picking up on the theme of universality, because I had the opportunity to look at the text that David was working on and looking at the language. I wonder if you could speak to an example or two that you find particularly powerful in terms of how that language was shaped.
As far as the retranslation?
Yes.
Right, that's what I've been calling it. Yes. Let me think on that while I ask you a question, though. Which is to dive in just a little bit more to the idea of universality. We talk about it a lot. This is a distinctly Christian text that we are saying has a universal message.
Yes.
We've said we are universal, we are not universal or Unitarian Universalists. Will one of you take that on in a soundbite? What it means to be universal, still working from a text that is focused.
So I am very much, I love when you talk about the three, that number three. I'm very Trinitarian. A lot of people who are mainline Protestants who are more into expansive theology are not Trinitarian. But I believe that the three parts of the Trinity show us the three parts of the sacred in very distinct and very inclusive ways. And it is, as Richard Rohr says, a dance. It is a dance between the three of them that makes the sacred possible for us. And within that, I believe that Jesus is the example of what we can be, of who we really are. We've talked in this series about original blessing versus original sin. And I think the original blessing is what Jesus came to share, is that it is possible to know how good you are and how important you are, and that you are created in the image of God, and that image of God is very good. And you have two things to do: love God and love your neighbor. It's really simple. So we are Jesus-focused, which is different than many Unitarian Universalist churches. Some of them are very Jesus-focused, but we are more of that in this place. But we have taken a lot of the dogma and the set beliefs that you have to believe, and we've opened them up and said, let's look at those through the eyes and the life of Jesus as we know that. And I think that's why we're different. But I also think it's why people of other faiths feel very comfortable here, because following the way of Jesus is a good way to live your life. And so they can connect with that, even if they don't understand or see Jesus as that figure in Christianity that we put into a box that you had to see and believe.
Yeah.
Michael?
And I think, too, it comes from a position of humility, of I don't know, and I'm never going to know, and the more I get into the mystery of God, it seems the less I know.
Yes.
Or knowing how much I don't know. But it's also a position of welcome and inclusivity, to expand on what you were saying, Laura, that allowing space for the multiplicity of journeys that we are on.
Thank you for that very impressive, very succinct response to a very difficult question.
I think talking about this church for me and people of all faiths, no faith, coming here, it was amazing last Sunday to see Fahad, who is a Muslim, conducting it in Carnudas Est. And, it's almost like revealed to me, in a sense, that there's more that unites us than separates us.
I would clarify. I think Fahad would say he grew up a Muslim. I'm not sure he would claim himself. I don't know. I haven't ever asked him that question, but he certainly has that background.
Of that tradition.
Yes. I think he sees himself more universal now.
Yes.
I need to ask him that question before I fully represent him in public. But the conversations we've had, it seems like he feels like he has touch points with many faiths.
Yes.
Which is not taking away from what you said at all. It is profound.
Yes.
The work that he brings to us because of his background.
And he brings that tradition. You know, I agree. There are many times when he's conducting that flashes through my mind.
Well, you know, that makes him a bridge in a sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he's so respectful of so many traditions because he's lived in so many different traditions. That he is the embodiment in many ways of what we're talking about.
Yes.
And also exciting that he started the sacred music series he has because of that. Anyway, without getting off on Fathead too far, it's a conversation we could have in its entirety somewhere else. But Michael, you asked me about the text. And we have a tradition here of that acknowledges that language is people's portal into their understanding and to their emotion. And we are not shy about altering language if we feel like that will help people come closer to themselves and to their spiritual experience. For example, we tend to eliminate male pronouns for God and pronouns that focus on deity as being related to wealth paradigms like king, Lord, those kinds of things. It doesn't always work, but we really try to even that out because it takes away one power element that the church or particularly white males have wielded against others in the past. And in any older text, we have to acknowledge that there was that power paradigm, that the white male leadership was so often aggressively in charge, even in horribly disastrous ways that have led to pestilence and war and death and destruction over centuries. So that is a part of this tradition that we acknowledge by addressing the language. The creed, as you mentioned, the credo, is laden with more of that power paradigm language probably than the rest of the Mass. So I spent a lot of time looking at those words and figuring out how we could communicate the essence of the text in ways that people wouldn't trip on the nomenclature of the language as it is translated word for word. So for example, the Confiteor, which we will sing this next week, it's one of my favorite moments of the Mass where Patrick mentioned chant focused. This is actually a chant. The organ plays a chord and the whole choir chants. Confiteor unum baptisma in remissionem peccatorum. And I believe in one baptism and for the remission of sins. Just within that nugget is a lot of trips for people. The idea of original sin, which I'll talk about often, versus original blessing, which you promote here, is right there. And the one baptism, the idea of baptism is so Christian focused that yes, in the creed, the Christian creed, that makes sense. In this sense of universality, if other people are listening to it, what does that mean for them? We don't want to eliminate the parts of the faith, but we do want to illuminate the essence of it. So as I chewed on it, and thank you Michael and Patrick both for weighing in over time, I translated that into, I confess to a universal hope for healing for all people through humility and compassion. Because in that text we also hear of Jesus humbling himself. As it goes on, I seek unity with those who have gone before, and with all life now and to come. Which that's almost a direct translation from what it was, but just a couple of word shifts, and it becomes this very Celtic statement. And like in the Annus Dei, instead of who takes away the sins of the world, Lamb of God who feels our suffering. These shifts to personal connection that I feel like follow the kinds of universal statements through Celtic theology that we're talking about that I hear in the music. And yeah, I was careful with it. I did ask a lot of opinions because those changes are a big deal to a lot of people. So we're not trying to step on people's experience. I say in the voice world, I don't want to take your language away from you, but let me help you understand it. Let me help you find ways to understand it in a way that makes more sense for you. So I don't want to create language that's going to get in your way. I don't know if y'all have thoughts about that.
as Laura says all the time, and part of the language I've adopted is, we language things into being. We help create the world that we want to through our speech. So if you have an understanding of God as totally apart from the world, that's going to influence how you live or how you look at power in the world. So challenging those kind of things are vital, we think, and part of what we're trying to do here. So, and it's delightful to see some of these changes. I think they're profound, but I also think they're faithful to the broader tradition that we hold and are trying to recover in some sense.
Yeah, I think I've thought through this whole conversation about how in difficult times in the world that the Christian church especially puts up the fortress. We're going to barrel down and we're going to protect and we're going to push the things that are right and true and we're not going to veer. And I think it's so interesting that that's not what's happening here. And that the Mass came in to support and to be woven into, maybe we were woven into the Mass or maybe the Mass was woven into us, but we're weaving together. Not this idea of we're a fortress, but instead it's an opening. It's a new opening. And I often say about language, we sometimes call what we do inclusive language. I don't really like that term anymore. These days I'm drawn to saying it's expansive language because I think that's more accurate than inclusive. And it's not so much, we do take certain things away, but I think we've added a lot more. So when we say the Lord's Prayer, we name so many names that are possible for God. And I think that's what's happening here, and I think what you've done with that and what you allowed to be done with that is just part of that expansiveness that I think is a gift to this church, but I think it's a gift to faith and to religion.
Indeed.
Yes, I was going to say one thing. The Creed is the different section of the Mass. Every other piece is a sort of a mantra, and whereas the Creed is it's a profession of faith and belief, and it had its origin in the Apostles' Creed, which is quite early, and I think grew organically as well. And the Apostles' Creed is quite open and non-dogmatic, but then as the church became more of an organized body, they felt the need to define certain things, and then we had the Nicene Creed, which is a much larger, expanded prayer and defines exactly who Jesus is, the idea that he is a both divine nature and a human nature, and the Holy Spirit as well. It defined these things, but it is quite dogmatic. And but that was a time when most people were quite uneducated, and today people can think for themselves, I think, and I like David's translation a lot. It's beautiful, it's poetic, and it's also very, very sincere, and for that reason, I think it's appropriate, and I'm glad it's the official translation on the sleeve of the album.
Thank you. Yeah, and David Conley, who sings in the group, was in my backyard helping me cut a tree down, and we had just started recording this. Actually, we had just had the meeting with you. We hadn't actually recorded the first track yet, and I was asking about it. He grew up Catholic, and he's who really triggered me into starting to think about this, because he talked about how the Mass to him was a statement of universality, he was very focused on the spirit of it, not the letter of it, and that was an inspiration. And then I brought that to you just the next day, and you started riffing off of what he had said, and I said, okay. So it very much grew organically, and thank you for saying that. I'm also interested in, so just to say one more thing about that, the first movement of the Credo, you set in unison, which is, and it's incredibly beautiful to sing, but just to point again to the idea of everybody singing the same thing. We're all together. There are subtle gestures like that throughout this work that are just incredible.
It felt like an anthem, the words when I read them. So that's the way I approached the music.
You've also talked about the Kyrie as You talked about why you said it in lower voices.
Yeah.
Because it's set for TTBB, although all of our singers sang it, male and female together. An inherent in your explanation is a justice theme that resonates really strongly with us, that I don't know how important it was to you, but will you just talk about how you came to the setting of the Kyrie?
Well, the Kyrie it's a very short prayer, and Lord of mercy, Christ of mercy, but it's in Greek rather than in Latin. And I remember years and years ago, my father was telling me that the Kyrie originated from, in ancient Rome, the people heard these Greeks, Christian slaves, reciting this prayer. And so when the Romans became Christians themselves, they incorporated it into the Latin Mass. And that was my father's version of the story. I haven't been able to verify it on Google, but it makes sense.
Yes.
And
well, regardless, it's your story for the piece.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so when I was studying it, I wanted the piece really to be evocative of the chant of the Eastern Church. The music we hear in Greece, all of the Balkans, and in Russia, where we have this incredibly sorrowful and pleading singing in male voices. That's so different from traditional plain chant in the West, which is pure and simple. This is very emotional.
And you do something unique to the choral world today, which is you say explicitly you want it expressive and sung with a lot of vibrato, which you said to me 4 times before we ever, in our very, very first meeting. And then we played with it, and I had to really instruct the choir that that's what we were going for. And it almost comes off as this operatic statement, but in doing so, it is extraordinarily emotional because the range, it's all of these gesticulations that have this big growth and then die, and they layer on top of each other. And that image of slaves chanting, mercy, mercy, comes through in that 7-minute piece that you just let it live there for as long as it does. And when it's done, I'm like, I need some more. It's just so powerful, especially knowing that story.
It's a 3-note motif again in the Kyrie, and I hadn't thought about that before. But I suppose that was subconscious as well. And it's actually a fugue based on a 3-note motif, which is difficult to write.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked that one so much that I recorded all 4 parts because I just couldn't not sing all of them, which is quite a thing because it goes quite low and quite high, but it was fun to do.
Yeah.
Where do you think this comes from within you? You said, it was maybe subconscious, or where do you think all of this comes from?
Well, I discussed writing the Mass with my father many years ago, and I wrote it when I was living here in Los Angeles. I had a few false starts, and I eventually completed the Mass 10 years ago, but after just starting and stopping many times. And LA is a difficult place to live. It's hard. And I think I was going through some tough times when I was writing the Mass, and it helped me reflect on my own humanity and just on the human condition in general. And I think that was what was in my mind when I was writing it. And nothing more than that. Yeah.
Remembering what you always knew.
Yes, and also, it only really makes sense now. I really didn't know what I was doing. And maybe I was channeling something that I was not aware of. But now that it's come here to this church, it all makes sense in a way that it didn't before.
And when it came here, you said you were focused on the human experience and that you were experiencing suffering, and that we found you. Christoph and I knew about the work prior to quarantine and had discussed it, and then we went into quarantine, and so nothing was being discussed other than what's happening tomorrow, because we were racing to get a service out every week. But it did come back around, and we had lunch, and it was a year into the pandemic, as we mentioned in the last interview. And I hadn't heard you say what you just said, but here we are in the midst of this worldwide suffering, and we find this peace where you found light in your suffering. And I think that's not a small statement.
No.
I'm curious, for the two of you, when I brought it to you and said, hey, there's this project, Christoph and I just had lunch with Patrick Cassidy, and I think it's going to fit really well for our Lent and Eastertide. But again, there was no time to really sit down with the work. What was your experience like from that moment through to the end of May? And even now, as you reflect on it, what does it mean to you?
You were in an interesting place during that time.
I was, yeah,
That's
going
right.
through some very personal things and challenging health issues. The word that continually comes up each time I hear this work, almost regardless of the movement, is healing. It was part of my journey. I remember getting new tracks from David, as they were available, and that truly became part of my recovery. So for me, it is deeply personal and continues to expand what that means in my life. So thank you.
And mine is not nearly that wonderful. As often is the case when David and Christoph bring things to me, I listen and I nod and I'm thinking about where it fits or how it fits. And I usually, almost all the time, say, sure, that's fine, let's just do it. Without having really a lot of, you didn't bring me anything to listen to, it was just, I have a lot of faith in them and I trust them and I trust the presence of God in the sacred, that somehow these pieces will come together. And I remember the first one, hearing it and saying to my husband, whoa, I think that's from the Mass. I was like, because it hadn't really sunk in. I concentrate on the liturgy. That's my piece. And we weave those together. But it was a beautiful surprise. And then, as I've said, so deeply moving to me and gave me space to really feel and to, I guess it was healing in some ways. I guess I could agree with that because those were probably the very few times I cried, during that whole period.
It holds a lot of space for us. I said before, I'm so excited to experience it as its fullness. In February, we'll do the first live premiere of it. And an hour worth of the music back to back with hopefully hundreds of singers from across LA.
Sounds
I think
so wonderful.
that moment of healing, I'm very excited about.
Yeah.
Yes.
I suppose that the Mass, I wrote it to evoke a sense of peacefulness and contemplation. And Christianity is a religion of peace. That's ultimately what it is. And an interesting thing was your sermon, Reverend Michael, yesterday about John Scotus, Erugina. He believed that in the end, nobody is damned, everybody is saved.
Yes.
And it's an interesting thing, but I think it's a good thing, like you do in this church, to explore theology continually, rather than getting fixed. And because as humans evolve intellectually, we should be able to see new things that were hidden before, I would think.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think as a minister, Michael and I, we even talked about it this morning, some, the changes in us as we experienced divinity school, as we started in our first churches, as, it was constantly changing. And what you said, his belief that in the end no one is damned, that is universalism. That is it. And, for me, that happened in divinity school. And I remember just that feeling of this all makes sense now. If that is the key, this all makes sense. And then, of course, I wrote a paper for a theology professor extolling, my understanding of it and all of these things. I didn't get a good grade on that. She did not follow that same sentiment.
John Scotus would have given you a good grade.
Yes, yes.
Well, Patrick, I'm curious, a really beautiful thing has happened through this project, and that you've become part of this community. I say beautiful for us.
Yes.
I feel like my experience has been improved by your presence and your brother's presence. And y'all are here most Sundays now. It's not every day that you get to have an experience of creating a new major work to begin with, but then to do it so closely connected with a composer. But I'm curious what your experience has been like becoming part of the community.
This is a very sacred spiritual place, I feel. And Frank and I, my brother, we followed the services online for the last year, and now we're experiencing it in person in the church. And but I think one thing that really affected both of us deeply was the Holy Thursday ceremony. That was very special, and something I hadn't experienced in any church ever. What you did, yes.
Yes, Holy Week was not the easiest thing we did. It was, I think, both years. Of all the services, I think those were the hardest. But I also think they were meaningful for us.
Yes.
And Michael and I got to do one together. And then I stepped in for you on the other one in Holy Week. And that week especially, I've never experienced anything exactly like it. And I think it will always be really important to me. And I think it's a gift. I realize that the creativity that exists here, the earnestness, the expansive theology, all of those pieces are a gift. And they're a gift to us to be part of it, for all of us. We're doing life together, and we're doing it together in such a beautiful way. And we just pray with each piece that is a gift to the people that hear it and that experience it too.
Yeah, and to that end, we have a CD, which is something I don't
So
know that this
exciting.
church has ever done, if it
No.
has for decades. And we didn't go into it thinking that. We went into it thinking we have this beautiful work that we can use across 2 liturgical seasons, and realized that it was something more as we were compiling it, and that we wanted to go forward with making something that people could take home with them to have the impact. What does that mean to each of you to have contributed in this way a new major work that is expansive in the ways that we've talked about and now is tangible to people?
For me, simply gratitude to be a part of it. It's that simple. Yeah, and the joy I experience has been my playlist to and from church, which changes how I arrive at church to work, and changes how I go home and process my day. Something that tangible has been awesome.
I often say that these experiences are the things that ministers dream of. We dream of being part of something like this, and I feel so very grateful for the opportunity to work with you all, and this new opportunity to work with you and to get to know you.
Likewise.
I've enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, and Patrick, your presence has truly been a gift, to know that you're a part of the congregation each week, of you and Frank both.
Yes.
I've cherished our conversations, and I look forward to more.
Likewise. Well, I think for the musicians, me, David and Christoph, it was certainly a labor of love. And each 3 of us are quite different, but we're it's a very dynamic trio. There's the
We've heard
number
that.
3 again. And but
There you go,
we all cover for each other well. We've got our own good areas, and it's been a fantastic collaboration. And I'm astonished by how well this has turned out musically, but also the spiritual home it has found here is something I did not expect at all. We do get minor miracles in music when everything comes together, but the spiritual aspect of it is something, that was something I can't even explain.
It's beautiful. And now I'm going to read off a few credits, but y'all be thinking about this, a response to this thought. What do you hope for this work as the future moves forward? Where do you hope to see it move people or land or happen to it, etc.? And for everybody watching, reminder that the On You Stay is out today. That is our 4th single, so you can listen to 4 movements today. And on Sunday, this coming Sunday, November 7th, we're going to have an All Saints commemoration service that will be largely musically based. We'll do about half the service will be music, and we'll sing some movements from the Mass there as well. And we encourage you to bring a memento of a loved one who has passed, particularly during the COVID era. And it's going to be a very emotional, very connecting experience, so I hope you will come and participate. And then on the 8th, next Monday, we will release the full album. Yay! Full album release, and Patrick and I will be here with Christoph Bull, and we'll talk all the nitty-gritty of how it came together and the behind-the-scenes stuff, so it's going to be fun. And then on the 14th, we will have a signing party for CDs. That will be the first Sunday it will be officially released here. So come to that service, and afterward get Patrick and Christoph, if you want to, myself, or whoever, to write their name on your disc so it's commemorated forever. That's going to be a fun time too. So a couple more weeks of exciting times with this piece, and then in February, like I mentioned, February 5th, we will have the live premiere, and we will look forward to other choirs joining us. We'll look for more of that information on our website, fccla.org/the-mass-album for more direct information. So, what do you hope for the Mass in the future? Michael?
I hope people have the opportunity listening to it to stop and simply be, to rest, to experience healing, to experience hope.
Laura?
I hope that people will look at it with new eyes. So people that have seen religion in hurtful ways, in ways that have made them feel less than, that they will experience this as the opportunity to step through a new door and to feel that healing that I believe really is in every single part of this.
And Patrick, the last word?
I hope that people who listen to this Mass find it peaceful. And I also hope it helps First Church in its important mission.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And thank you to
David.
our behind-the-scenes help from
Yes.
Oliver and David and everyone else, Molly, who came up with this idea. And thank you all for watching, and we'll see you on Sunday.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay.